You've probably never once considered it. Chicken, beef, fish, completely normal choices. No hesitation required. Here's the uncomfortable part. Crocodile meat is leaner than chicken, higher in protein than beef, and farmed by the millions every single year, just not for your dinner plate. The reason has almost nothing to do with taste, and almost everything to do with something wired into your brain long before you ever learned to read a menu. So let's actually ask the question properly. Why does an animal that's genuinely healthy, genuinely edible, and already being farmed at industrial scale remain almost entirely absent from Western food culture? Because the honest answer isn't that crocodile tastes bad, or that it's somehow unsafe to eat. It's a specific combination of ancient psychology, religious history, and industrial economics, three separate forces that happened to point in the exact same direction. Let's start with the meat itself, because this is where the popular assumption falls apart immediately. People who've actually eaten crocodile consistently describe it as mild, closer to chicken or fish than anything exotic or unusual. Nutritionally, it holds up remarkably well against the meats you already eat regularly, notably lean, high in protein, and low in fat compared to most conventional livestock. This isn't some fringe health claim either. Several countries where crocodile is farmed at scale actively market it specifically on these nutritional merits. So if the meat itself isn't the problem, the explanation has to be sitting somewhere else entirely. History actually undercuts the "it's just naturally unappetizing" theory even further, because crocodile consumption has genuine, extensive historical precedent. Ancient Egyptians lived alongside the Nile crocodile for thousands of years in a relationship complicated enough that the animal was simultaneously worshipped as a deity in some regions and hunted, eaten, and fully utilized in others. Across parts of Africa, crocodile has remained a genuine, unremarkable food source for centuries. Aboriginal communities in northern Australia hunted and ate crocodile long before European contact, not as some exotic delicacy, but as a practical, reliable part of survival. This tells us something important right away. Whatever aversion exists isn't universal, and it isn't some deep, unchangeable human default. It developed somewhere specific, for specific reasons. One of those reasons connects directly to religious dietary law, and it's a genuinely underappreciated piece of this puzzle. Several major religious traditions established specific rules about which animals were permissible to eat thousands of years ago, and reptiles frequently landed on the wrong side of those rules. Jewish dietary law, kashrut, permits fish specifically defined as having both fins and scales, a definition crocodiles simply don't meet, placing them outside permitted food categories entirely. Within Islamic dietary tradition, scholarly opinion on reptile consumption has genuinely varied across different schools of thought, creating enough ambiguity that, in practice, many communities defaulted toward caution and avoidance rather than risk. Once a food exists in that kind of permanent gray area for long enough, entire populations simply grow up never treating it as a real option in the first place. Not because anyone actively decided it tasted bad, but because the question of whether it was even allowed never received a clear, confident answer. Religious history explains part of this pattern, but there's something considerably older running underneath it, something that predates any written dietary law entirely. Consider which animals dominate typical human diets globally. Cattle, chickens, pigs, sheep, virtually all of them prey species, animals positioned below humans on the food chain. Now consider a crocodile specifically, an animal genuinely capable of killing a human within seconds, one that has actively hunted humans throughout an enormous stretch of shared history. In parts of Africa today, Nile crocodiles remain responsible for a meaningful number of human deaths annually, not through rare, freak encounters, but through a sustained, ongoing predator-prey relationship that has persisted for as long as humans have lived near the rivers these animals inhabit. This creates a genuine psychological conflict worth examining directly, because human dietary instinct appears to follow a fairly consistent underlying rule: eat what sits below you, remain wary of what sits above you. A crocodile doesn't just complicate that rule, it inverts it entirely, asking you to treat a historical predator as a meal rather than a threat. Researchers studying disgust and fear responses have identified this specific pattern as a threat-based aversion, structurally similar to the instinctive flinch response most people have toward spiders, a reaction that has little to do with actual present-day danger and everything to do with deep, evolutionarily embedded threat recognition wiring that activates well before any conscious, rational evaluation occurs. There's a related layer worth exploring here in more depth because researchers studying disgust psychology have found something genuinely interesting about what specifically makes reptilian animals feel unsettling in a way mammals typically don't, and it comes down to something researchers sometimes describe as emotional legibility. Mammals share enough observable behavioral cues with humans, blinking patterns, facial muscle movement, responsive body language, that most people can intuitively read a rough emotional state just by watching one. A dog looks anxious. A cow looks calm. That legibility creates a subtle sense of relational familiarity, even toward animals people have never personally interacted with. Reptiles largely lack these same readable cues. A crocodile's eyes don't track and respond the way a mammal's do, its face carries no flexible expression, and its stillness before striking looks identical to its stillness while doing nothing at all. Researchers studying this specific gap have found it tends to register less as calm, and more as unpredictability. And unpredictability, evolutionarily speaking, has never been a quality that made something feel safe to eat. None of this fully explains why the door stayed permanently closed, though, and this is where practical, modern economics takes over from ancient psychology. Cattle and poultry were bred over countless generations specifically for efficient meat production, fast growth, manageable temperament, straightforward processing. Crocodile farming developed along an almost entirely different track, and Australia's industry offers a particularly clear, well-documented example of exactly how that track was built. Commercial crocodile farming there developed overwhelmingly around leather, premium exotic hides destined for high-end handbags, belts, and boots, a market where a single finished leather product can sell for tens of thousands of dollars depending on craftsmanship and brand. Within that specific economic structure, meat becomes something closer to a byproduct, sometimes discarded outright, sometimes sold cheaply into local or tourist-facing markets almost as an afterthought, rather than the primary product the entire operation exists to produce. Processing itself reinforces this imbalance further. A crocodile's hide is thick. The animal remains genuinely dangerous to handle even in a controlled farming environment, and full processing requires meaningfully more specialized skill and time than handling conventional poultry or livestock ever does. When an entire industry has already built its infrastructure, expertise, and profit model specifically around leather, there's simply never been enough independent commercial pressure to justify building a fully parallel meat-focused supply chain around the exact same animal. The meat isn't being suppressed. It's just never been anyone's actual priority. And demand itself depends heavily on basic familiarity, something most Western consumers have essentially never had genuine opportunity to develop. Crocodile meat rarely appears in grocery stores, restaurant menus, or family kitchens across most Western countries, meaning there's no meaningful cultural pathway through which someone could develop a taste for it, positive or negative, in any ordinary, everyday context. You can't crave or specifically avoid a food you've simply never once been offered. It's worth being genuinely clear that this entire pattern isn't universal, because plenty of regions around the world have already worked past this exact psychological and economic barrier, and examining exactly where reveals something important about how arbitrary this whole boundary actually is. In parts of Australia, crocodile appears on restaurant menus, often positioned toward tourists, but genuinely normalized within that specific context. In Zimbabwe and South Africa, crocodile farms regularly sell meat locally alongside their leather operations rather than treating it purely as waste. In Thailand, crocodile shows up grilled, stir-fried, and even processed into jerky, sold with the same casual regularity as any other regional specialty. Vietnam and Cambodia have developed genuine crocodile farming industries supplying both meat and skin to established local markets. Meat and leather treated as genuinely co-equal products rather than one being an afterthought of the other. The most instructive example, though, might be alligator in the southern United States specifically, because it demonstrates exactly what happens when the same basic animal encounters a genuinely different set of cultural conditions. Alligator, a close relative of the crocodile, sits comfortably within mainstream Cajun cuisine in Louisiana, appearing in gumbo, sausage, and fried preparations served with the same casual normalcy other regions reserve for chicken wings. The key difference wasn't the animal itself. Alligator carries a broadly similar profile to crocodile in terms of both nutrition and the same reptilian features that triggered disgust responses elsewhere. What differed was the surrounding cultural pathway. Louisiana's alligator population was abundant, locally accessible, and became integrated into regional cuisine gradually, through genuine repeated exposure across generations, rather than being introduced as an unfamiliar, occasional novelty item the way crocodile has remained almost everywhere else in the Western world. Familiarity, built specifically through consistent, everyday exposure rather than rare or touristy encounters, appears to be the single factor capable of genuinely overriding both the ancient threat response instinct and the religious ambiguity hesitation we've already covered. This connects to something genuinely worth reflecting on beyond crocodile meat specifically, because the underlying pattern extends well past this one animal. Nearly everything currently sitting on your plate, and everything you'd instinctively refuse to put there, passed through a specific combination of filters long before you ever had any say in the matter. Ancient threat recognition instincts shaped across an enormous span of evolutionary history. Religious and cultural dietary rules established generations before you were born, and simple regional exposure determined entirely by where and to whom you happened to be born. None of that represents some kind of pure, individually reasoned food philosophy. It's inherited pattern recognition, absorbed early, rarely questioned, and treated as instinct simply because it arrived before conscious reasoning ever had the chance to weigh in. So the picture that emerges here isn't really about crocodile meat being fundamentally unappetizing, unsafe, or somehow biologically unsuitable for humans to eat. It's about an extraordinarily specific convergence of ancient predator-avoidance psychology, historical religious dietary categorization, and a modern industry economically structured around an entirely different product, all quietly working together to keep a genuinely edible, genuinely nutritious animal permanently off one culture's menu while it remains completely unremarkable, even beloved on several others, including one just a short drive from wherever many of this video's viewers happen to live. So the next time something on a plate strikes you as instinctively, obviously off limits, it's worth pausing to genuinely ask where that specific reaction actually came from. Because somewhere on this planet right now, someone is calmly eating exactly what you'd instinctively refuse, and somewhere else, someone would recoil at whatever's sitting on your own plate tonight. Neither reaction is more correct than the other. Both are simply running an old, inherited script neither of you ever consciously chose to write.